We were out pruning in the orchard a little bit this afternoon, and Ty says, what do you do when that tree gets really big? How do you prune that? I said, you graft a new tree. Okay, so we're going to graft some new trees tonight. And a lot of people think grafting is sort of magic. We've been doing grafting for a number of years. There's nothing magic about it. You just need to know what you're doing. So we're going to go through a little slide set here, and then we're going to actually do some grafting and budding. This gives you an idea why we don't grow apple trees from seed, okay? That's an apple tree that was produced from a seed from a golden delicious apple. They don't come true from seed. It's like saying your kids are going to look exactly like you, and there's not a chance. The same is true with apple seeds. There's just too many genes involved. So once we find a good variety, we propagate that clonally. So the golden delicious tree that you graft is from that one original seed that came up with golden delicious. Now sometimes they mutate along the way, and we'll talk about that. But we propagate our trees by grafting, and we propagate our rootstocks in a lot of cases clonally or by grafting. So there's a number of reasons for grafting. One is to obtain the benefits of certain rootstocks. Now you're familiar with dwarfing. That's what people think about for getting a small tree. It works a lot nicer if you got a small tree. It's easier to take care of, it's easier to spray, and our commercial growers are going heavily towards dwarfing trees because it gives you a return much faster on a per acre basis. You know, your great-grandfather grafted trees on seedling rootstocks. They were planted 30 or 40 feet apart, took it 20 years to get up to full production. With a dwarf orchard, you can get up to full production in 6 years, so you get a much faster return on your money. We're looking at yield per acre, not yield per tree. We get earlier fruit production. These dwarfing rootstocks cause the trees to produce fruit earlier. You can produce fruit on a little tree this tall. We don't want to do that, but they are very precocious. Some of our seedling rootstocks, it would take 6 or 7 years to get fruit on the tree. Disease resistance is what growers are interested in. We've got fire blight resistance. This is a bacterial disease that kills our trees. We have phytopthora root rot resistance. That's a root rot in the soil that kills the trees. We've got apple replant disease and resistance. These are in some of the newer Cornell rootstocks. When you have an old orchard and you take it out and you want to put apples back in, those old trees have developed a lot of detrimental microorganisms in the soil over many years. You stick a new tree in there, they jump right on it. It doesn't do very well. So in the past, we've tried to rotate our orchard. So if you had peaches in there, we put apples back in that spot or wait a number of years before we replanted. Some of these newer apple rootstocks, you can plant those where you took a tree out and they just grow like dynamite. They just keep on going. So that's something that's new. We have woolly apple aphid resistance in some of our rootstocks. This is an aphid that will feed on the roots of the tree, and it'll be on there for the life of the tree. We have some that have resistance, so they don't feed on the rootstocks. For a number of years, we could never get those off. We have some new pesticides that'll take those off, but they're fairly expensive. Adaptation to wet soils. None of our fruit trees grow on wet soils. They need to be able to get oxygen out of the soil, and if that soil is saturated, those trees do very poorly or they die. So you don't want to put these in a wet spot, but some rootstocks will do a little bit better than some others. Cold hardiness is another thing that they think of out for northern areas, but when I first started working here, we planted apples on Malling 9 rootstock, and I saw several years where those trees were injured by some of these cold northerners that came through. To give you an idea, here's a 20-year-old well spur. That's a type of red delicious. It's a spur type tree that has lots of these little fruit producing spurs on it that makes it naturally dwarfing, and on a Malling 7 semi-dwarf rootstock. Okay, here's a 17-year-old Star Crimson, another strain of red delicious on a seedling rootstock. Big difference in tree size. Okay. We use grafting to change the variety on an established plant. You know, you may have gone down to the corner and bought a really cheap tree or got a buyout sale, and after about 4 years it started producing fruit, and you thought you'd bought Granny Smith, but it was not Granny Smith when it started fruiting. So you have the chance of starting that tree over and taking another 3 years to get into production, or you can graft that tree over to another variety. Commercial growers find that the market demand shifts. You know, we have new varieties coming out that are a lot more popular that you can get more money for than for our old Red Delicious that nobody's buying anymore. So there's some reasons to shift over trees. This is called top working, and we can use top working to get better pollination in trees. Not so much in apples, but I was in a plum orchard in California a number of years ago, and it was a solid block of plums. They had to be cross-pollinated. They needed another variety out there. All they did was graft another variety in the top of the tree and paint it white, so they had plenty of pollination, didn't have to worry about harvesting that little stick of plums up there, and they had a solid block of plums. We use grafting to repair injured trees. You know, on a tree, the living portion of that tree is just like a glove that you put on the outside of the tree. And if the rabbits go in and girdle that tree, your tree's done for. We can do some bridge grafting to save damaged trees. We use grafting to get special forms of plant growth. Here's a weeping crabapple. There's a weeping cherry. Cherries don't normally grow like this. This was a special form that was found. Here's a weeping crabapple, but it's grafted up here. You can see the graft union, but some of the stock part has come up there that's blooming. The other part is down here that's the weeping part. So they need to cut that top part out of the tree. Okay, a few terms to think about. Scion refers to the part of the plant that we're putting in the stock. That's the grafting wood that we're using. That's the variety we're trying to propagate. The stock is what you're putting the scion into, and the rootstock is usually this stock that we're grafting into. The rootstock is the bottom portion of the tree. It's clonally propagated, so we've selected that rootstock for certain characteristics, and we've selected the top of the tree for certain characteristics. We have a term called an inner stem. One of the problems with dwarf rootstocks is they are brittle, and those trees will snap off if you have a wind. We've got a row of trees down at the university that are on dwarfing rootstocks. They've been there for about 10 years, and I've never staked them. And I've lost about 30% of them, just snapped off at the graft union. Now, you know, you get a heavy load of fruit in the tree, that's a lot of weight on there, and these graft unions on dwarf trees are not real strong. So in that case, we've got to stake them or put them on a trellis. One way to get around that is to get a rootstock like Malling Merton 111 that self-supports and put a stem piece of a dwarf rootstock in there. That'll give you partial dwarfing, and then put your variety on top. That's a three-part tree. This is not the way you would typically plant one of these trees. The soil line would be typically on the middle of that inner stem, but you can get dwarfing that way and get a tree that self-supports. Here's top working. This is where we rework the top of a tree to put several varieties into the top of a tree or to change it over. We have cultivar. That's just a term for a plant that was found under cultivation. I'll probably talk about varieties just to keep it simple. Cambium is a layer of cells that lies between the woody portion of the tree, the inside, and the phloem on the outside. That's responsible for producing the phloem and the xylem. If you don't get the cambium hooked up, your graft isn't going to take. If we look at a cross section of a tree, you can see the phloem out here in this little cell layer thick. It's 2 to 5 or 6 layers thick is the cambium, and this is the xylem on the inside. This is what we call the meristematic tissue, and that's what makes this graft grow. If you don't get this portion lined up between your stock and scion, you've kissed your tree goodbye, okay? Seedlings are, we've talked about that a little bit. If you plant a seed, you don't know what you're going to get. We've used those as rootstocks. They typically give you a full-size tree, so we don't use those much anymore. It gives you a standard or a full-size tree. And clonal rootstocks are rootstocks that are propagated clonally, so they're pretty much identical. So we can get it. We want a uniform orchard out there with all the trees the same size. We've got a whole bunch of apple rootstocks to select from. If we look at this, if we put a Golden Delicious on a seedling rootstock, we'll get a tree that's 100% size, okay? If we put that tree on a Bud 9 rootstock, it'll be 25 to 35% the size of the seedling tree. Trees are different than people. How many of you are not getting any taller, okay? Trees keep on growing throughout their life, so a dwarf tree can get pretty tall over time. And we control the size of that tree by the variety we put on top. Some varieties are more vigorous than others. by the rootstock we put it on, by getting a crop every year and putting that energy into fruit rather than growing wood, by laying back on the fertilizer bag a little bit, and by pruning that tree every year to keep the size down. So that's how we control the size of the trees. Here's an example. Here's a Malling 7 semi-dwarf rootstock. We've got some of these in the back. There's an older rootstock we don't talk about too much anymore, Malling 26, and there's a Malling 9 rootstock in the back. Those are all golden delicious trees, and they're all the same age, so it gives you an idea of the differences in the sizes of trees that you can get. Malling 27 and Malling G65 are trees that are too small for us. This is G41, that's one of the newer ones, one of the exciting trees. It's a little hard to get those rootstocks. This is Bud 9, it's a Budagovsky, it stands for Budagovsky 9. It's a Russian rootstock. P2 is a Polish rootstock. You don't see too much of that. Malling 9's kind of gone by the wayside for us. It's too fire blight susceptible. G11 and G16 are some of the first Geneva rootstocks that came out. Malling 26 is pretty subject to fire blight. This is a new Geneva rootstock. Here's a new Geneva one. G30 is about the same size as Malling 7. Hasn't really caught on. Malling Merton 106 used to be one that we used when I started working here. We've gotten away from that. It's pretty susceptible to Phytophthora root rot. Malling Merton 111, which we've got in the back there, is 80% the size of a tree. It does well on difficult sites. If your soil is too dry, too wet, too shallow, that one will hold up and do pretty well. But it gives you a tree that's 80% the size of a standard tree, which is a little bigger than I want in my backyard. This gives you an idea of the relative sizes of the trees. And this is not an exact science. You'll get variations in there, but it gives you an idea. And here's some of the characteristics of some of these rootstocks. This is G41, one of the newer ones. It's 30 to 40% the size of a standard tree. It is fire blight resistant, collar rot and woolly apple aphid resistant, tolerant to apple replant disease. It's precocious, doesn't send a lot of root suckers up. What we're talking about are these sprouts that come up from the root that you've got to crawl under that tree and cut off. We don't like those. It's no fun cutting those things off. If you've got an acre of trees to crawl under, you try to get somebody else to do it, okay? It has high yield efficiency. We are looking for rootstocks that give us a small tree that produces a whole lot of apples. We don't want a small tree that doesn't produce many apples. So we're looking for yield efficiency. That's really important. Here's Bud 9, 35% the size of a standard. It's hardier, more fire blight and collar rot resistant than Malling 9, and it does require support like all of these other dwarf ones. We're pulling away from Bud 9. It gets fire blight. The ones at our Princeton Research Station, most of the trees that we've lost have been killed by fire blight. These Geneva rootstocks are really good. They make that cross and get that little seedling, and they plant them out in a flat in a greenhouse, and they spray them with fire blight bacteria and kill as many as they can. Then they take those survivors and they plant them out, and the next year they spray them with Phytophthora root rot back and try to kill as many as they can. So these ones that they've got are really disease resistant. So but the problem is it takes about 20 years to evaluate a rootstock to decide whether you've got a really good rootstock. So we're still looking at these. We have what we call a North Central Regional Rootstock Trials at our Princeton Research Station in Western Kentucky, where we test a lot of these under Kentucky conditions, and they're testing them all over the United States and Mexico and Canada to come up with some rootstocks that survive, that do a good job. So that's an ongoing program. I'll skip over G935. That's about 50 to 60% the size of a standard. Malling 7 is what we've got in the backyard. We've planted this one for 40 or 50 years, and this is the basis of a lot of our orchards in Kentucky. It's a semi-dwarf tree, about 65% the size of a standard. They can get pretty big. I've got some 22-year-old ones in Lexington. They're getting kind of big right now. And then Malling Merton 111. That was one of the first ones to come out with woolly apple aphid resistance. It's long-lived, performs well on wetter and drier soils, and it's fairly large. It's a freestanding tree. Now we can get Malling 7 to freestand too, so that's why a lot of our growers still like that one. These are some of the new Geneva rootstocks, and they've got a whole bunch of new ones that are coming out, so you'll be seeing a lot of these coming out in the future. I've just put this in the, see, I forgot to bring those in. I've got a handout out in the car on this, but this shows you the resistances and what the rootstocks are tolerant of, to give you an idea of which ones look like they've got some potential. So question is, how do we get these clonal rootstocks? And we start out with a rootstock. These are just found by chance. You know, they found out that a rootstock produced a dwarf tree. You know, seedling rootstock produced a dwarf tree years ago, and then they sort of propagated that from suckers. And so they'd get a little rootstock and they'd plant that out and let it grow for the first year, and the next spring they cut it off pretty close to the ground. Well, that's a heading back cut, and that causes that rootstock to branch, so it sends up a lot of suckers. So in the spring they mound some sawdust over that and keep it moist, and then those shoots grow up through that. And where those shoots are growing up through the sawdust, they become what we call etiolated. The wood is sort of yellowish, and that changes the growth regulator situation in the wood, and it roots. And so it'll root in that sawdust during the summer, and then in the fall the nursery cuts those off, and that's what they sell is clonally propagated rootstock. So we get a genetically identical rootstock to graft onto. That's called a stool bed. Looking at pear rootstocks, that's a different ball game from apples. Pears are very susceptible to fire blight, the bacterial disease that kills the trees. So that's one of the reasons you don't see a lot of pear trees in Kentucky. A lot of you probably heard of Kiefer pears. Those are an old variety, really good for canning and making pear butter, but it's got a lot of sand grit cells in it, but it survives the fire blight pretty well. It's a really late apple. It's on there at frost, and a large pear, and you harvest those and have to sit them up for a while to start softening up, but they're really good for canning. Quince rootstocks used to be used a lot for dwarfing. We've gotten away from they're pretty fire blight susceptible. Pyrodwarf is a new one that's come out, but I think it's still too susceptible to fire blight for us in Kentucky. The Old Home Farmingdales out of Oregon are the ones I think are the best ones for us. We've got an Old Home Times Farmingdale 97 that gives you a tree that's 90% the size of a standard tree. Old Home Farmingdale 87, which gives you a 65% size tree, and I think that's the best one for us. If you can get that. Old Home Times Farmingdale 333 has been out there a little longer. It tends to reduce fruit size slightly, so if you've got a choice, these are both good. I'd go with the Old Home Times Farmingdale 87. Pyrus Caleriana is used as a rootstock. That's the same as the Aristocrat and Bradford pears that you plant along the roadside as an ornamental pear. It's fairly fire blight resistant. That's why they survive out there on the roadsides. Pyrus betulifolia is another species of pear that's got fire blight resistance. We recommend that for Asian pears. Asian pears are a different species of pear. They're sort of that apple pear. They're not crossed with apples. They're just a round pear. They're picked when they're ripe. They're very crisp and juicy as opposed to the European pears that we let soften up to eat. And then Pyrus communis is the same genus and species as Bartlett, which is very fire blight susceptible, so I wouldn't recommend that as a rootstock. What these can do is send a sprout up from the root, and fire blight can hit that and go down into your root system. So that's why we don't like those root suckers. For peaches and plums, we're still using seedling rootstocks. These are varieties of peach. Lowell is an old variety of peach. You take a seed off of that, plant it, and graft onto it. It gives you a full-size peach tree. But those three stocks are ones that seem to survive really well for us in Kentucky. Peaches, if you can get a 16-year-old peach tree, you've got a really old peach tree. Rutgers Redleaf is also one that works fairly well for us. Myrobalan is a really good plum rootstock. That's been used for many, many years, and it survives very well in our conditions. For cherry rootstocks, for tart cherries, we've got Mahaleb, and then the Gisela rootstocks are some that are out of Germany that are being used a little bit. For sweet cherries, and I don't recommend sweet cherries, they're really tough for us to grow and get to survive in Kentucky. There's a lot of things stacked against sweet cherries. The worst is when they're getting ripe, they've got a high sugar content, and they get rained on, and then they all crack on the tree. So, and then there are some Russian rootstocks that are coming out that we're starting to look at. We're putting a few of these in at our Princeton Research and Education Center. Okay, let's talk about collecting our grafting wood or scion wood. You need to collect that now when it's dormant. To get these things to take, you need to have dormant wood. You can't go out, take something with leaves on it and graft it on and expect it to take, because it requires water and it just dries out and dies. But with dormant wood, you've got a chance for that connection between the stock and scion to take place, and then it knits together and it survives. So we'll collect the wood when it's completely dormant in February or March. You want wood that grew the previous season. Look for wood that doesn't have fire blight on it. Okay, you can pick that out this time of the year. Bundle it up, label it, wrap a moist paper towel around it, or you can put some moist sawdust around it, put it in a plastic bag, and then put it in the refrigerator, not the freezer, in the refrigerator. That refrigerator will keep it dormant. How many of you have apples in your refrigerator? Apples give off ethylene gas, and it'll age your graft wood so it doesn't graft very well. So what I do is I triple bag it in plastic bags, and that works. Plastic bags let ethylene gas through them, but triple bagging seems to work okay for me. Some people will bury it in the soil, in the garden, 6 or 8 inches down, keeps it cool. It keeps the buds from coming out. You're trying to keep it dormant. Okay, the graft we're going to be doing tonight is the whip graft. You're going to start with a rootstock here, and we're going to make a slice on the stock, or the scion, and a slice on the stock, and then we're going to put this little tongue in here and slide it together and wrap masking tape around it. And that's what it'll look like when you're finished with your tree. There's the rootstock down there, there's the scion variety on top. So what do you do with this tree after you've grafted it if you want it to survive? Well, you want to wrap a moist paper towel around the rootstock, or newspaper. And we're talking moist, we're not talking sopping wet. If you stick a sopping wet paper towel around there, you're going to go into that refrigerator and find everything covered with mold. Okay, so moist paper towel works well. And then store it about 50 to 70 degrees for 10 days. You can store it under the living room couch if you want, in the dark. And that warm temperature will cause callus development, and it'll cause that tree to knit together. We're early enough in the year that it's a little too early to plant it outside. So after it's callus for about 10 days, stick it back in the refrigerator to hold it till probably end of March, beginning of April, when you can plant it out. Then what you want to do is set your trees, and I would suggest putting these in the garden for the first year. If you plant it out where you want it in the yard, one of you guys is going to mow that thing off as it's just getting dark. Okay, so, and they don't compete in the yard very well against the lawn and the dog and everything else. So put it in the garden, put some chicken wire around it, keep the rabbits from eating it off. And you want to put it with this graft union at least 2 inches above ground level. You got to keep that graft union above ground level. What happens if that graft union goes below ground level? Your golden delicious part of the tree is going to root, and instead of a dwarf tree, you'll have a full-size standard tree. So don't let that graft union get too low. And some of you guys that have big augers on your tractor, and you go out to plant that tree and you dig a 3-foot deep hole to make it so it's nice to let those roots go down, what will happen is you'll plant that tree just perfect, and then it'll settle down another 6 or 8 inches, and your graft union's below soil level. So don't dig that hole when you're finally planting that tree too deep. Put them in the garden about 12 inches apart in a row, and water them in good and let the soil settle around the roots. Then sprinkle about a tablespoon of 10-10-10 around each tree after you plant it, and then in April and May. What you're trying to do is grow a tree very fast, get a nice big tree the first year, so we're putting lots of nitrogen on it. So after you graft the tree, you line it out in the garden, and that's what they look like. Not a whole lot sticking out of the ground. Protect them from rabbits. A rabbit can chew those off really quick. We're going to be grafting with masking tape. So there's the desire to, once that tree starts growing, to carefully peel that masking tape off. Don't do it. You'll peel the bark off with it. Just take a knife and slice it down both sides and let the tree push that masking tape off. When the shoots are about 2 inches long, select the best one that's growing straight up. You just want a tree with one trunk. You don't want a forked tree down there. You're going to have 2 buds on that scion. You just want one to grow to give you one trunk. just rub the other one off and let the one go up. So you're producing one straight shoot. And then let it grow in the garden for the summer and then transplant it in late fall. After it's dropped its leaves, you can put it in its final position. You want to transplant it when it's dormant. Here are some trees that we grafted in the horticulture class at UK. You can see a whip graft right there. What happened there? We grafted a flower bud, didn't we? Apple trees have mixed buds. They've got leaves and flowers. And a lot of times on that scion wood, if you get buds from the top, you'll have a flower in there. So we don't like to pick the top portion of that scion wood to graft. But if it produces flowers, it'll still go ahead and produce a shoot, but it sets that tree back a little bit. It doesn't grow as much as we like. Okay, this is a cleft graft. This is what's done on older trees while the trees are dormant. Probably a little early to do that. I probably do this mid-March or so, and I'll show you how to do that here in a minute. But we're going to take our scion wood and slice it down on both sides, split this open, wedge this open, and slide these two scions in the side here so that the cambium lines up, right like that, okay? And we're going to tilt this just very, very slightly so that we know the cambium lines up in there. Then we'll there we have the cleft graft, and then we'll cover it with a tree coat type grafting compound, and you can see the buds are starting to grow on that. And here we are, we're partway into the season. When you've got a big rootstock underneath there, those shoots grow very vigorously, and you can see that's 1 year's growth after we put a scion in. So we replaced the top of the tree. Here's a year or two later. We've still got both of those going, but we'll cut this off to one that's growing in the direction we'd like a branch to go on that tree. So here's that same tree with the top converted over. You can't see it with the cherry trees in the background, but I put 1, 2, 3, 4. I had 5 varieties on that tree at that time. So that's kind of nice in the backyard. If you've got a limited space, you can have 5 varieties that harvest over a period of time. You probably want to concentrate on some of the later ripening varieties, because those are the better ones for storage. And ones that ripen about September into October and November store the best over winter. This is a bark graft. This is done later in the spring when the bark is slipping. You know, right now that bark is tight. We can't do this type of graft. As the tree grows, that cambium loosens up and the bark slips at the cambium. We'll come in with our dormant scion wood, make a ledge cut here and slice it down towards the tip. And we can make a slice here, slide that underneath the bark, tack it in with a couple brads, and then cover it with the grafting compound and put a little dab on the top there. And this is another variation on that where you just cut down both sides and tack it in. Here's another bark graft. You don't have to have grafting compound. You can use aluminum foil and a plastic baggie. This works just as well as grafting compound. And here you can see that this tree is just cut off just above the ground level, and we've grafted over a new trunk on that tree. Trees that are grafted like that grow really fast, and so you get a really nice shaped tree. When a tree's growing really fast, those limbs lay out there really well. If the tree's growing slow, you tend to get limbs that are kind of vertical and with narrow branch angles on them. This is a bridge graft. This is what we do where the rabbits get in and damage your tree. Hopefully you've put a rodent guard on, but last year I had a rodent guard on my tree, and the snow was really high and they got up above the rodent guard. So here we have an injured tree. Now typically you don't do this on a tree that's girdled all the way around. If it's girdled about 50%, we can usually bridge graft over those and get them to work. But we'll cut that bark and clean it up. We'll take our dormant scion wood, make a slice here, and make a little slice in the bark and slide it under there and tack it in. And then we'll shove it in under here. And we want to have a little bit of a bow on that so it accounts for that tree rocking in the wind. If it's really tight, it'll pop those nails out on us. And this is a bridge graft over a sun scald injury on the southwest side of the tree to repair that sort of injury. So, you know, you've got 5, 6, 10 years invested in a tree like this. You don't want to lose it. So that works. And then you would put grafting compound around there to keep that from drying out. This is a situation where the voles get in there and eat part of the root system off your tree. What you can do is take one of these dwarf rootstock trees and plant it there and inarc it or graft it into the side of the tree to put a different root system on your tree to help it survive. Budding is another way of propagating trees. If you buy a tree from a nursery, they're typically budded rather than grafted like we're doing tonight. It takes very little material, it's very rapid, and the commercial budders are extremely fast. We were at Stark's a number of years ago and I couldn't get my camera focused before they were on to the next tree, so that's how efficient they are. We can bud in the spring with dormant wood, or we can do late summer or what we call fall budding with wood that grew the current season. And this is a T-type bud. This is done with a shoot. Typically this is done in June or maybe July. You go out, and peaches are budded typically. You go out and get a shoot that grew the current season, and you want buds from the middle portion of that shoot. You'll cut that leaf blade off, leave the little petiole to handle it with, and then cut that bud off the bud stick. Here on the tree, the trick to get these buds budding to work is to have your tree growing vigorously. So you have to keep it watered during the summer so that that bark will slip. If it's drought stress, that bark won't slip. You won't be able to put this bud in. And so you make a T slice here and slice here, the bark's slipping. You pry your bark up a little bit, slide your bud in and cover it with a budding band. You cover everything but the bud. And then the next spring, after it's wintered over, this bud is essentially dormant. It needs a chilling requirement to start growing. That's the dormant part of this graft. And next spring you cut your tree off and train your tree up from that one little bud. And you get a budded tree. Here's some other pictures. There's a dormant bud that's sitting in there in the fall. There's a peach tree that was cut off to force the bud right there. There's all sorts of different types of budding techniques. There's a chip bud. I'll show you how to do that a little later. There's a lot of different ways of grafting, and there's no one right way. There's, like anything, there's a lot of different ways of doing things. If you've done a good job of whip grafting your tree, that's what they'll look like in next fall. If you've done a good job of growing it. Now, the two things that people slip up on are keeping the weeds controlled and keeping them watered. That's got a really restricted root system under there. You need to keep them watered to get them to grow, and of course the fertilizer. These are trees that are budded in August. This is the way they grow trees commercially. They get that rootstock and they plant it and let it grow for the season. Then in August they'll put a bud in it, and then the next year they'll cut that tree off and force that bud. They've got a big root system under there, so they get a lot of tree growth. And people go to the nurseries, they see a big tree, they want the biggest tree there. They figure they'll get fruit faster on a bigger tree, but a lot of times it's a lot harder to get an older tree to survive. Sometimes we have incompatibility. We'll have some overgrowths, but there's a tree on a dwarf rootstock that wasn't staked, and that's what can happen when you get a fruit load on there. Problems, fire blight. That's tough on young trees, so I would suggest trying to get some varieties that are maybe a little resistant to fire blight, and keeping an eye on these. Pull the flowers off of these young trees. We can have fire blight hit the base of the trees and kill the trees also on older trees. Occasionally on some of the rootstocks we get dogwood borers in there, and they can kind of girdle the tree and aren't very good. Usually not a big problem. These are voles. This is a pine vole. There's a mouse, and there's a shrew. Voles are these little short-tailed mice. Shrews are insect eaters. Moles, M-O-L-E-S, are insect eaters. But these are plant eaters, and this is what they can do to the bottom of your tree underneath the ground. It's very disconcerting because they really get going when we've got a lot of snow cover and they don't have much to eat, and they go under there and work on our trees. You have to be really good at growing fruit trees with a tree like that to get that one to survive. So occasionally we have management problems. Kid with a weed eater, okay? I always have people come in, I want to graft an apple and a blueberry together. It's not going to work, okay? they've got to be pretty closely related. So some of the things that are compatible, apple is compatible with apple. Pear, quince, and hawthorn are all compatible. You can put a peach and a nectarine and a plum all on the same tree. Blueberries and sparkleberries, you think, well, why would I want to put a blueberry on a sparkleberry? Well, you can grow a blueberry tree that way. And so they're interested in this for commercial blueberry harvest, where they shake the blueberries off the plant. They can catch more blueberries with a trunk rather than all these stems sticking up. Pecan and hickory are compatible. Here's a really old 57-year-old pecan tree grafted on a hickory tree right there. You can see the graft union right there. That's in South Carolina. But we would not normally graft a pecan on a hickory. We would graft a hickory on a pecan because it takes a long time for hickories and pecans to produce nuts, maybe 15, 20 years to get a good crop. The faster you can grow that tree, the faster you get nuts. So pecan is a much more vigorous rootstock than a hickory. And then black walnut and Persian walnut and butternut. These are for the pros to graft. These are really tough to get to take. So let's do a little bit of grafting here. To graft, you need a sharp knife. Okay, this is a grafting knife. Ty was saying it's flat on one side and it's beveled on the other side, so it cuts kind of like a chisel. So you need a sharp knife. You can graft with a pocket knife, but a really sharp knife is important. And there's a number of different ways of sharpening knives. We've got diamond stones you can use. I usually just use a regular whetstone. This is an oil stone, and we'll put a little oil on this. And you put that knife down and you go back and forth. Some people go around in circles, other people go like this. You want a pretty, about maybe a 20-degree angle there that you're working for to sharpen. Now, what's the purpose of this oil on here? I don't need it to make it slip. Yeah.
It's to, where the grit comes off, it's to hold the grit to it to make a smoother surface.
That helps. But a lot of the reason for the oil is to pull the little steel shavings that are coming off the knife and get them out of there. If you don't use an oil on this stone, you'll tend to plug your stone up so it doesn't sharpen very well over time. So we'll do that on this stone, and then for a while, this knife's pretty sharp as it is. And then this is a hard Arkansas stone. This will put an even finer edge on your knife. And so if you go like this, you can get a really fine edge on this. Once you've got the fine edge, what you do is you get a little burr that comes up on that, and I'll lay it down flat and go this way like this to take that burr off. Barbers use a strop. You know, in the barber shop they use a strop. That's to take that little steel curl off and just leave the really sharp edge on your knife. So we've got a good sharp knife. We'll take the oil off of it. Let's talk about selecting graft wood. There's a branch, and you can see this one grew all the way from here last year. So that's a pretty good piece of graft wood. You can take water sprouts out of the tree for graft wood. These buds down here near the bottom, we've got some woolly apple aphid damage on here, so these areas are really swollen. But a lot of times the buds down at the bottom are not very well developed, so we really don't want those buds. What we'll do is come up here part way, and that's a really good section of budwood, and probably this section up here. A lot of times we can get flower buds from the top here. So this is, there's good graft wood off of that shoot. Take the water sprouts out of the tree. You certainly don't want to take sprouts off the root system. That won't give you an apple that you want. Put those in a plastic bag with a moist paper towel and seal that, squeeze the air out of it, put it in the refrigerator to store it for when you're ready to use it. Okay. Let me demonstrate a cleft graft here for you. This is a cleft graft. If you're going to switch out, put another variety into another tree, or if you've got the wrong variety on the tree, you want to switch it over to another variety. This is something that can be done while that tree is still pretty dormant. We'll come in with, this is a cleft grafting tool, and we'll put that on there. And this is a mallet. I'm going to put this on the floor because this is a plastic table. You can use a hatchet. You don't have to have a cleft grafting tool. Okay, you can see we've split that. Now you can use a screwdriver or to wedge that open. Now, where we decide to put this cleft graft on the tree is important. You don't want a limb that's horizontal, because horizontal limbs don't grow much. You don't want one that's going straight up. You want one that's growing out and about the direction away from the trunk that you want, okay? And don't graft it out on the tips of the limbs, because you won't get many apples off of that. You want it inside the tree so you can get some limbs coming off of that, or in the top of the tree. So we've selected a spot where we've got fairly straight grained wood. You don't want to select a spot where you've got a branch coming out of there, because that's not going to split very straight for you when you split it. So we come over here to our graft wood, and we're going to cut it off to make a new area on the wood, and then we're just going to take it. Now notice how I'm cutting. Most of you are going to do it like that, okay? That's a good way to get your neighbor, okay? What you're going to do is grab the knife like this and just pull the stick. You can't cut yourself when you do that, okay? And what we want is a nice smooth cut, and that's where having a sharp knife is important. Now, if you usually don't get a smooth cut on the first cut, but if you make a couple cuts, you get a pretty straight cut. That's not the type of cut I want. But what we're going to do is make a cut on one side, and we're going to make another cut on the other side. And what we want is a cut where it's pie-shaped towards the bottom and pie-shaped towards the back. So it's wider here than it is on the back side, okay? Because we want it to clamp on the cambium up here. So we want 2 buds. We're going to cut it off about 1/4 inch above the top bud. And we're going to slide this one in here on the wider spot. If we need to go down a little further, we'll put this in so the cambium's, it's got a slight tilt to the outside, and we're going to do an identical one here. Slide this one in right like that so the cambiums cross. And we're going to take our cleft grafting tool out so it's pinched in there pretty good. Okay? And this is tilted just very slightly going out, and the other one's tilted. Now, I need to cut this off to 2 buds. Okay, so that bud's a little too close, so I'll rub that one off and cut that one about 1/4 inch above that. So what we can do is cover this with a little aluminum foil. This aluminum foil is to keep that graft union from heating up too hot in the sun, okay, and cooking your graft. So we'll wrap that around there like that. And we'll just take a little lunch baggie. Pull that down over the top. Then you can use a rubber band, or this is a budding band. Just wind that around like that. And then we need to keep this from drying out on top here. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. This is parafilm, but you can put a little dot of Elmer's glue on the top there, or a little dot of fingernail polish, okay, just to keep that top from drying out. So there's a cleft graft. You can pass that around, take a look at it. Okay, let's do a whip graft here. This is a Bud 9 rootstock here. We've got our graft wood with our moist paper towel in it. And this is the Spartan variety of apple. Try to get the cyan wood matched up with your rootstock. If you're doing this for the first time, it's not a bad idea to get a paper towel and sort of wrap it around the root system so it doesn't dry out too much. And what we're going to do is come in here and we're going to pick a spot and make a nice straight cut. This is Budagosky 9. It's pink. Or Bud 9. Okay. Then we're going to make an identical cut on our cyan wood. Now that's, so you want your stock and cyan about the same diameter, okay? And ideally, I've got a little bit of a slight concave cut there, but you want them pretty straight, okay? Now this is where the Band-Aids come into play, okay? This is where we're going to put this tongue cut in here. We're going to come 1/3 to 1/4 of the way down from the top. This is the exact way you don't want to do it, because that stick's going to break, and guess what's going to stop the knife, okay? Take your thumb. You guys are off of farms. You got strong hands, okay? Put your hand right here, put it 1/3 to 1/4 of the way down, and just make sort of a tongue cut in there, right like that, okay? Can you see how we put that little cut in there? All right. You really want to do this pretty fast. Then you come over and do the same sort of cut on your cyan. And 1/3 to 1/4 of the way down. If you go halfway, they're not going to match up. 1/3 to 1/4 of the way down, and you make a cut right down like that. You got some control with your thumb there. Then you're just going to slide it together right like that. If they're the same diameter, they'll match on, the cambiums will match on both sides. And if you squeeze it together, you don't see any sunlight through there. So we've just got it put together. And then what we'll do is we'll take some masking tape and wind that around, starting at the bottom. Main thing you want to do is put it on tight. You don't need 10 layers on there. You just need to put it on so it's tight. You need good contact between the two cambiums, between your stock and cyan. Okay, are we ready to go? Is that a well-grafted tree? You think that one will survive? Probably not. Okay. We've got a rootstock. We've got a limited amount of water coming out here. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 buds on there. They're all going to put out leaves, and they're going to say, pump me some water, and the root system's going to say, not a chance, okay? So we're going to cut it down to 2 buds. That improves our chance of survival, and then we can put fingernail polish on the top, okay? The sparkly stuff works really nice. These are my daughter's rejects. That'll keep that from drying out, okay? Okay, then we need to put it in a plastic bag. What didn't we do? We didn't label it, did we? Okay? You better label it, because Ty isn't going to be able to tell you what you grafted on there. Okay, so you can label them with aluminum foil, or I'm sorry, these aluminum labels, or I've got some plastic labels. If you use these plastic labels with magic marker on, make sure you make a map of where you plant them, because you won't be able to read that next spring, okay? That magic marker will dry out. So we've got Spartan on Bud 9 rootstock here. So we're set. We've got a moist paper towel in there. We'll put it in a plastic bag and seal that up. And then you want to let that callus for about 10 days. Warm it up. That tree will start growing. It'll heal it together. And then put it back in the fridge till you're ready to plant it in the spring. Okay? I've got a handout here that I'll give you that tells you what to do once you take this home. Okay? Let's take a look at some of our graft wood here, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things we've got here. This is Nittany. This is a variation of York apple that we used to grow a lot of for making apple pies. It's a pretty firm apple, stores really well. This one's fairly subject to fire blight. This is out of Pennsylvania, but a good tasting variety. This is Red Free. This is scab immune variety, so you don't have to worry about spraying it for scab. It is a little bit more subject to fire blight. In our home fruit spray guide there for apples, it gives you a rundown on some of these disease-resistant varieties. It tells you which diseases they're resistant to. Molly's Delicious is apple that looks like Red Delicious, tastes a whole lot better than Red Delicious. It's a summer apple, ripens in the middle of August. It's a nice big apple. It's sweet, colors up fairly well for us. A lot of our apples don't color up very well in the summer for us because of our heat. But this one colors up well. It'll store for about a month. Summer varieties have a fast respiration rate, so they don't store very long. This is a nice tasting apple. It makes great apple pies. Spartan is a Macintosh type apple. Macintosh is very popular on the East Coast. We don't grow many Macintosh here because they don't color up. On the East Coast in New York, it's a bright shiny apple. For us, it's a green apple with a few red stripes on it. Not very marketable, but it is a nice tasting apple. It's a softer apple, has a lot of fruity volatiles. This one is one that just happens to have scab resistance. So it colors up fairly well and it has scab resistance. It's not an extremely large apple. Enterprise is one of the disease-resistant ones. It's got very good resistance to apple scab, fire blight, cedar apple rust, and powdery mildew. Ripens up latter part of October. A little more on the order of Rome apples, I think. Gold Rush is a very scab-resistant apple. It is pretty susceptible to cedar apple rust. We've got lots of cedar trees around, so you need to spray this one for that. Ben Davis, if you're looking for an heirloom apple, this is a really late apple, ripens really late. We used to grow a lot of these and put them in barrels and ship them down the river. None of our commercial growers are growing this one. It's not a great apple, but it's an heirloom. This is Melrose. This is a variety developed in Ohio. Nice big apple, a really nice tasting one. Colors up fairly well. It is great for apple pies and fresh eating and making applesauce. Here we have red Fuji. A lot of you like Fuji. Fuji's a tough one to grow. It's real susceptible to fire blight. It's really difficult to thin, and this red Fuji doesn't color very well for us in Kentucky. There are some redder strains of Fuji that color up better. I should talk to you about what a strain is. We have a lot of, the first Red Delicious apple that was found was called Hawkeye Red Delicious, and you don't see that much anymore. It doesn't color up very well, and what growers found that after they planted it in 20 years, they started pruning them pretty hard. Some of these little latent buds came out, and some of those buds mutated, and they started finding branches on the trees that had extra red apples, so they grafted off of those. Those were the double red apples. Then they got the triple red mutations off of those, and then we got into spur type apples. And Red Delicious now does not taste like the original Red Delicious. We've selected for deeper and more red color, so Red Delicious colors up now before they're even ripe. They're very healthy because they've got lots of antioxidants in it, but they taste a little bitter to me. The spur type apples aren't really ripe when they come off the tree. They've got to be in storage a little bit to develop some flavor. Here we have Golden Delicious. I think you're familiar with Golden Delicious. Ripens up middle of September. Florina ripens up latter part of September. This is a red apple. It's a really nice one. Terry Jones, that used to work here at the station, this was his favorite variety. For those of you that have hard heads, this is Honeycrisp. Really difficult variety for us to grow in Kentucky. It gets cork spot and bitter pit. It doesn't color, it doesn't store. The white apple leafhoppers love this one. So do the deer. This is a little bit of wood of that Hawkeye Red Delicious that I was telling you about. Chesapeake is a variety that was found in Kentucky at Browning's Orchard up around Moorhead. This is sort of a mutation of Rome. Nice tasting apple. Lodi is a really early apple, ripens about early part of July. This is really outstanding for applesauce and for making fried apples and so forth. It's a really tart apple. I can't eat them very well, but it makes outstanding applesauce and pies. Because it's so tart, you add some sugar to it. That sugar, high acid, sugar-acid ratio makes it very good to eat. Here we have Empire. Let's see. This is one that grows very well for us in Kentucky. It colors up really well. It hasn't really caught on in our commercial channels very much.